I would like to welcome architect Bijoy Ramachandran to moderate the second session of the day on vulnerable ecosystems and resilience. Bijoy is an architect and urban designer and founding partner at Hundredhands, a multidisciplinary design studio based in Bangalore. The studio draws on a keen sense of the urban, in their projects often represented in patiently executed analytical drawings. The architects have redirected their focus on the urban context by returning to the questions of scale, character, spatial and visual impact, and remaking the public domain, all of which is so vital to the tempestuous urbanism of Indian cities. Bijoy is also one of the Avani Advisory Council members. Thank you, Bijoy. Over to you.
Thanks, Meenakshi, for the introduction, and welcome to all of you who've joined today in the afternoon for the second session of the Avani Symposium, Normal Ecologies of Adaptation. So this session revolves around the question about vulnerable ecosystems and resilience. If you'll bear with me, I'll just read out the sort of summary of what this call to arms was, or call to charge was, to Himanshu and Deepta, who are our speakers for this afternoon. The ecosystem of human inhabitation is constantly vulnerable to recurring shocks, thrusts, and collapses. In the face of unpredictable challenges, ecosystems rupture, be it the environmental attributes, socio-economic structures, political and institutional systems, and so on. The global pauses pose disruptions to the various realms of contemporary human society in the face of uncertainties, subverting the normative concepts of living. With the rapid onset of the pandemic, we are witnessing the immediate ramifications on the socio-ecological systems and its compounded repercussions, leaving potential long-term impacts on the ecosystem, which causes certain enduring cracks in the fragile built and unbuilt envelopes of existence. It has revealed the ecosystem's vulnerabilities and systemic challenges in adaptation. What could be the emergency recovery plan? Can we be responsive to these persistent uncertainties and be responsible in creating models of sustenance and resilience? Is it the time to ponder on our role as design practitioners and actors in the current scenario of rifts and pauses, working in the interface of social lives of people within these infinite web of systems and cycles? What could be an advanced perspective of generating a design discourse for evolving, resilient, and buoyant ecologies of adaptation, which can survive, sustain, and progress? Of course, in the light of the past three, what can only be termed as apocalyptic months, this session, at least for me, seems to be incredibly urgent. I'm really looking forward to our two speakers. Today we have with us Deepta Sateesh. She's a design researcher, educator, architect, and planner, working in landscapes in conflict. Her environmental practice is focused on creating new pathways in design, education, and policy. Her doctoral research in the Western Ghats of India gathers situated practices, movement, and the politics of the colonial eye, and draws from design, environmental humanities, and philosophy. She's also a dancer, equestrian, cellist, wanderer, and photographer. She is a director and founder of Odde Research Center and Dean of Research and Collaborations at the Srishti Manipal Institute of Art, Design and Technology, Manipal Academy of Higher Education. The research and projects of Odde Research Center are concerned with the environment and its inhabitants, oriented towards revealing and generating new possibilities and frameworks for nature-culture synchronicities. The center's work is framed by wet ontologies and is focused on design of environmental policies that are inclusive, emergence of participative eco-pedagogies, and framing of responsive adaptive everyday practices. Research and practices at the center are collaborative, gathering communities, NGOs, researchers, and young learners and government organizations. She is a member of the Consortium of Environmental Philosophers, senior advisor at the Forum for Law, Environment, Development, and Governance, member of IUCN, Commission on Education and Communication, and co-editor of the book Product Service System Design for Sustainability, a collaboration of the EU Asia Link Program Learning Network on Sustainability, LENS. Welcome, Deepta. And our second speaker today is Himanshu Burte, who is an architect and urbanist. He's an associate professor at the Center for Urban Science and Engineering, CUSE, IIT Bombay. Most recently, he was the editor of a special issue of Marg magazine titled Infrastructure as Space, Development and its Discontents, September 2019, and co-editor of Urban Parallax, Policy and City in Contemporary India, Yoda Press 2018. He researches subaltern urbanism, socio-spatial impacts of urban infrastructure, and the transition towards sustainable architecture and urbanism in India from a broad concern with spatial justice and environmental sustainability. Both Himanshu and Deepta, of course, is in Bangalore, like me. Himanshu is in Bombay. Both of them are what I would say lapsed architects who have found their calling, sort of looking critically at the practice of architecture, now sort of, mostly working, looking at the practice in a way to respond, in Deepta's case, to her concerns of these wet ontologies, her research on the Western Ghats. And Himanshu, of course, has written articles and books, and it has initially looked at architecture in the way that it is both the production of artifacts, but also as agency, as people and patrons coming together to form these artifacts. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation today. We'll start the afternoon session with Deepta, so I'll let you begin, Deepta.
Good evening, everybody, and I'd like to thank Avani Institute of Design, and thank you, Salmini, for inviting me, and Bijoy for that rather generous introduction. And thank you, everyone, for attending this evening. I guess what I'd like to do first is I'd like to begin with sharing an experience when I was last at Avani in 2018. It was the 9th of August, and I had been invited to say a few words at Avani's orientation event, along with Bijoy, who was to give the inaugural talk. The monsoon season had set in over a month earlier, bringing incessant rain to the Ghats, and that day was no different. We had gone from the Calicut airport straight to the campus, situated along the Ghat slopes in the midst of a 200-acre rubber plantation. The school structure itself is built into, or partially built into, a lateritic rock. Walking around, I'd noticed the rock and soils were oozing, enlivening the environment of the college, while a light, steady rain persisted, a rain that you could walk in. It reminded me that we always live in a world that is shifting, transforming, and fluid. The day's events had begun. I said a few words to the new students very briefly, emphasizing the importance of learning and drawing from the environment that the college is set in, and not to ignore the rain, weather, and terrain that is situated along these sensitive slopes of the Ghats between Wayanad and Calicut. My words were slowly being drowned by the sound of rain. For the inaugural speech, we moved into a community hall nearby, built for local farmers, situated along the main road that cut the steep slope in the Ghats, a road that had been used for centuries as a trade route. By mid-afternoon, the rain had become louder, completely drowning out Bijoy's voice, even on the microphone, and he had to stop speaking at times. Later, as tea was served and photos were taken of the attendees, we heard news of massive landslides and floods nearby. The road to the guest house where we were staying that night on the Chaliar River was underwater, being surrounded by paddy fields. So we were promptly whisked off to the Sapati's office and director's home instead. There we watched the news that kept showing a clip of a group of men in dhotis standing on a narrow road that cut a slope, the road crumbling and washing away under the force of the waters, while they just stood there a few feet away, marveling at the sight. Early next morning, the flight back to Bangalore just before the Calicut airport closed, as the runway close to the sea was completely inundated. That day, unbeknownst to us at the time, water from the largest dams in Kerala, Idukki and Idemalayar, were open for fear of the dams breaking under the pressure of the amount of water that had collected in the reservoirs. The officials had waited far too long to release water, and rather than a gradual release, had to open multiple sluice gates simultaneously. Madhav Gadgil was on the news sharing the devastation having been caused by thoughtless construction projects for development and the lack of clearly demarcating ecologically sensitive zones for conservation in the Ghats. Some of the areas were affected by the events that day, were colonial monoculture plantations of teak forests, tea and coffee plantations, and intensely cultivated vials throughout Wayanad, Coorg, and South and North Canara. The plains and coast saw waters everywhere, the backwaters and canals gushing, while many of the locals near the coast took to their houseboats during this time of inundation. Many slopes of the Ghats had also been washed away in these places. These events have been largely attributed to climate change, of when, where, and how much rain has fallen. That a certain amount of rain that has fallen on those few days was more than usual in a particular geography. The floods, and particularly landslides of 2018 and 19, are not necessarily markers of only increased rainfall. Following Gadgil's clues, perhaps it was a colonial misunderstanding of the terrain, to which I add a lack of adequate understanding of the weather, the way the earth transforms with it, and the abilities to respond to this dynamic world. It's not possible to predict exactly where, when, and how much rain will precipitate. And when it does precipitate, it becomes water on the surface. It becomes muddiness, mist, and wets materials. What we need to consider is that in the Ghats and beyond, the monsoon season is a time of great change, of renewal, revitalization, initiation, birth and death, motion with movement of water, inhabitants, materials, and atmosphere, and the emergence of new things, processes, and practices. These are things that cannot be controlled by policies and laws, and the lines we draw to manage them, the weather, non-human species, soils, and their interdependencies among sentient beings that are also continually adapting, changing relationships, never going back to an original state or form. Ecologies in the Ghats are dynamic and diverse in this wet, humid terrain with a multitude of spatial appropriations across time. This is flux, a non-equilibrium. Yet we continually desire equilibrium that is status, and change is always excluded. This making ground of inhabiting, inscribing lines of practices into the earth, corresponding with atmosphere, may be seen as a meshwork of movements that Tim Ingold writes about, that makes place in a weather world. I will elaborate this a little bit shortly. In the video clip we saw, there is one aspect that has remained outside of judgment and evoked a sense of pity or sympathy even, the road that collapsed. We forget that this is a man-made thing, seemingly fixed, permanent, pakka. It was designed by drawing a map or a plan, a form that privileges a view from above. We designed the habitat for humans by drawing lines on paper, in plans, elevations, and sections, and perspectives, and deemed them true representations of the world, of the past, and the world that is becoming into the future. But these are primarily ways to abstract space and freeze time, stilling the world in moments convenient to drawing plans, sections, maps, accounts, calendars, all regularizing and making predictable the shifting ground of the Ghats. So these are the slides that preceded what I was saying just now. The maps of tea plantations. This is the news article on the disasters and a changing dynamic world. And this is the map that actually first drew the road off which Avani is on between Wayanad and Calicut. Yes. So, what was I? Yes, okay. The dominant understanding of the environment has been of natural forces. Let me just do a fit screen. Yeah. The dominant understanding of the environment of the Ghats has been of natural forces deemed as the other, outside and devoid of human engagement in it. This environment or habitat has been visualized and managed from a distance, and little has been investigated and understood from the ground of the world through the inhabitant. The visualization has been constructed to separate nature from culture, outside from inside, creating conflicts and violences. In the Southwestern Ghats, and particularly since its designation as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2012, conflicts have escalated on the ground, emphasizing the need to reveal a more fundamental source of these conflicts and clashes. The construction of these lines to make sense of and represent the Ghats, and solutioning for problems of breaching these lines, that are floods and landslides, comes from the Enlightenment period, a time of the search for knowledge of the natural world. Knowledge that is possible to articulate and make known, never changing. This Western or colonial or outsider understanding is based on science and empiricism. Scientific study presupposes that nature is too complex, messy, and chaotic, but can be made understandable only through analysis and the study through disciplines. Here, a certain lens is required to unravel the natural world, to organize it in a way to study and gain knowledge of it and from it, and then represent it for others to consume. This quasi-scientific lens is one of a world that is uniform, stable, and predictable, one that draws lines to organize, manage, and control space, resources, inhabitants, and time, articulating the world as such to know it. However, there are things of this world for which these kinds of lines cannot be drawn, and these notions remain outside of the scientific and mechanistic view of the world, such as material movements, other sentient beings, and the conditions of wetness that shape-shift multiple grounds for dwelling in this monsoon terrain. There is a world outside of the colonial eye, an imagination that exists in the everyday contemporary that has not been engaged with in the world of design particularly. To think about this other world, I open up the possibility of two conceptualizations of the world. One of a drainage imagination, of the idea of surface that separates water and land, atmosphere and earth, wet and dry. Drainage is a function of extracting water out of material making a land-water divide permanent. I propose a threshold imagination, a world of seepage and soaking, of holding and releasing moisture, of inhaling and exhaling, transforming over time with water and rain, becoming conditions of wetness, from least wet to most wet. The two worlds that clash in the Ghats are between the voyeur and the walker. The voyeur, or the colonial administrator, surveyor, scientist, is one who gazes, analyzes, freezes, or arrests the world in space and time through the visual, using only a single sense, devoid of a sensibility of being in the world. The voyeur writes in order to read and reads in order to write, to represent the world in a way that can capture it, to interpret and represent in order to manage, strategize, assert power, and control. As one moves the eye from being in the ground up and above the ground, the world appears as only a static image to the eye, with other senses becoming inactive. And from afar, the world moves less, as one is unable to see the nuances and changes that occur at a scale of human engagement on the ground. The view from above is advantageous, although it is only a partial reality, a privileged perspective, as it hides other aspects of reality, of change, movements, relationalities, and time, what James Scott terms as the optics of power. Being in the world, in the ground of the Southwestern Ghats, with all senses and sensibilities actively making the world, an immersion into context and to be context sensitive. But when seeing from above, there are no sensations but vision. And from up there, the world is still a gigantic mass immobilized before the eyes, as Michel de Certeau says. What the eye gazes upon is but a moment, frozen, a world frozen to which comparisons and judgments of conditions can be made. That this is the condition, and it used to be like this, and it could be like that in the future. This world can be evaluated as everything is in its pakka state, fixed, finished, stilled, designed, the means to an end, to be judged, used, and so on. The elevated position puts the voyeur at a distance, outside of the world, outside of practice, not even to experience, but just to know in order to control. It is a political move. It is also a social move, placing the voyeur in control. The voyeur is above the walker. The voyeur controls the walker. The voyeur is the expert. The walker is the inhabitant. The voyeur's instrument is the map, an image, illustration, a representation of a moment in time. This is the world that's actually familiar to us. The conflicts are at a fundamental level of an inadequate understanding of the world, the environment, and sight. When we inhabit a threshold imagination, how can we see as a local in a rain terrain? The architect, planner, scientist, engineer must shed their view from above, that we take for granted to be true, and see what is here and now on the ground in the environment through wetness. How can we transform the way we comprehend the world of the Ghats? The first and primary difference is our engagement in the world, to pay heed to being the inhabitant first, rather than the professional. Before I go on now, I wish to share that some of the following ideas are not yet fully formulated, and I speculate and experiment with these notions and world makings in an attempt to develop them as practical frames towards new futures of nature-culture synchronicities, something that the voyeur is unfamiliar with. So let's engage with the seemingly unknown to speculate that diverse possibilities by entering the world of the walker. Here, I share my own experiences and understandings from walking with inhabitants of the Ghats, in particular in the wilds of Wayanad. What is distinct about farming families in this region is their understanding of different kinds of precipitation and rain, and how to correspond and adapt with them, each initiating diverse practices of not just cultivating in the earth, but growing foods such as pepper and vanilla that require particular conditions of atmosphere and tree trunks of moisture and humidity to grow. These conditions are brought on by seasonal changes in weather, experienced in the locale or particular context, such as nulmara, a thread-like precipitation that has become less common, mist required for seed conservation, and Karkadam Masa, the time of heavy rain and thunderstorms. This is a different understanding of time from the abstract, predictable, reliable, and accurately measured time of the Gregorian calendar. This is an understanding of time that is of patterns of a wet world, of diurnal flux and changes in seasons, that has not been paid attention to in design of materials, architecture, nor policy, but is significant as it rains for more than half the year in this region. The life world of the Ghats is continually changing in minute and dramatic ways of operations of growth, movement, and soakings. Here, time is embedded in the everyday ordinary in relation to the movement of materials and inhabitants, human and non-human. By the way, it has just started raining heavily here where I am. Although many farms and communities were unable to cope with the devastation of the floods and landslides in 2018, there were others whose creative practices passed down from generations worked with rain, precipitation, inundation, and the changing grounds. These included conservation of diverse seeds, working with the slopes between low and high grounds to create nurseries and transplantings, using medicinal concoctions of wild herbs to enrich the soils and saplings, and planting fruit trees amidst the paddy fields that attracted particular birds whose droppings strengthen roots. Recorded everyday practices of engaged understanding of the seeping world include curing seeds in misty conditions, thatching shelters made of mud, plastering porous walls with a mix of cow dung and ash, planting diverse crops along slopes to ensure diversity of soil, some of these that don't wash away easily, and that some varieties of paddy, even after a deluge, may not be consumable by humans, but is so for other creatures who then fertilize the earth. And there is a deep understanding of death and decay of materials that privileges soaking across dwelling practices. In this way, these small farms transform seasonally each ground of different rhythms synchronized with changing conditions, from bearing produce to laying fallow, of rhythms of movements and pauses. It is possible that the inhabitants of Wayanad are creative practitioners, continually constructing a dynamic matrix of multiple grounds and practices that nurture and sustain dwelling, not just for humans, but including the participation of other sentient beings and materials and movements. This terrain is a complex shifting matrix, a gradient of wetness, of things moving through it, with it, oscillating in between, and inhabiting particular places through practice time, moving through moments and inhabiting all at once. How do they do these things? How do they read a different world? What are the qualities of this world they live in? And is it possible for us, the urban, educated dweller, to, at the very least, partially convert into this sensitive, inclusive, and responsive inhabitant? How do they know and how and where and when to cite certain practices? When we ask these kind of questions, we seek a fundamental shift from problem identification and solutioning to seeking a richer, fuller, truer description of the world. Wetness and rain are inescapable in the Ghats. They inhabit a world that is always some condition of wetness that they correspond with. I place walking as a fundamental movement in ordinary everyday practice through a ground or milieu. It is particular and universal, a real way of being immersed. When we walk, how do we see and what do we see? By walking through a ground is like an ecotone. We traverse through atmosphere and earth and encounter inhabitants, rhythmically responding and shaping and moving with and through. This walking practice or practice of movement is a meta practice, one that holds all other practices and goings on. Henry David Thoreau elaborates on walking as a way of wandering, of giving in to the practice of walking without thinking about it, but thinking through it. Walking to thorough is a way of getting lost, not in a manner that one is clueless about one's whereabouts, but in a manner to find one's way through the environment, to be a creative practitioner in the everyday. This getting lost is a type of wandering that is of being immersed in the context and of a sensibility that acknowledges that phenomena are ephemeral, never to occur in the same way again. Tim Ingold further explores walking as being a material practice that involves paying attention to or demonstrating care through practice. This being in the weather world is possibly an existence to do something in order to do something later, a world of practices, operations, activities, and makings. This is also about the ordinary rather than the exotic. It is about the mundane where the consciousness is not called upon to make sense of it, but that the ordinary is everyday practice, of tactics rather than strategies, of responses rather than reactions, of fragility and vulnerability rather than predictability and permanence. Practices such as walking, thatching, sighting, searching for water, foraging, harvesting, or mending fishing nets, peeling and shelling adke, finding certain medicinal plants, and so on. This is an act of dwelling. The drainage imagination, however, is when the worlds are designed before they are lived in, or in other words, that acts of dwelling are preceded by acts of world-making. Ingold suggests that acts of dwelling are world-making. As Ivan Illich writes, dwelling is an activity that lies beyond the reach of the architect, not only because it is a popular art, not only because it goes on in waves that escape his control, not only because it is of a tender complexity outside of the horizon of mere biologists and systems analysts, but above all, because no two communities dwell alike. To be carrying on in being with the world, the earth, atmosphere, inhabitant correspondence, is a whole array of practices that continually make it by being in it, by dwelling, inhabiting, an immersive or insideness that is not enclosure, but merely keeps open a way for seeing the kind of spatiality which is required for dwelling. It is not just one practice nor space that defines the makings of the world, but a whole array of practices, skills, and movements that enable being in the world, a multiplicity, and as Ingold says, an entanglement in meshwork that describes the world. What does the shift from drainage imagination to threshold imagination do to the world we live in, and in particular to design, architecture, and planning? Do we go back in time and overthrow the systems our lives currently depend on? I once heard a tribal leader and healer say in his everyday parlance, "Munde hogbeku" in Kannada, which means one must move forward, pushing into the future through the present goings-on. This is what Tim Ingold calls correspondence, a continual making through time, entwined in changing threads of the past and holding multiple futures. If drawing is fundamental to design and we are no longer inhabiting a drainage imagination, what kinds of lines do we draw now? And some of this is resonating with Professor Chaya's talk earlier this afternoon, so I just wanted to draw that connection right here. And what kinds of lines are of a threshold imagination? Here are a number of speculations and thoughts in development. As for design, it would displace the value given to a teleologically driven design agenda, or a final output or product, or the pakka, seemingly permanent. It would transform aesthetic value and ideas of permanence. The emphasis would be more on process and practice rather than a final output that never changes. The kacha would be privileged and hold meaning in a moment of transformation, in a moment between the past and the future. In architecture, it would mean, in architecture, it would mean a highly mobile world, continually shifting, transforming, and inhabiting, and inhabitants who itinerate, seasonally or following multiple rhythms. Sight can no longer be only spatial, marked by boundary lines. However, the act of sighting is a practice that is relational to the landscape and its horizons and depths. This means having a practical understanding of material and temporal qualities of the terrain, of weather, soils, plants, human and non-human inhabitants who play diverse roles and move through seasons. Material understandings would also change. The art and crafts of natural building will become ever important to work with found materials that are related to sight. For example, today laterite is extracted from deep in the earth and is left exposed to harden. This extraction changes the makeup and movement of materials beneath the surface. And yet we wonder why Bangalore has so many sinkholes, or the ghats and coastal places become inundated quite often. This particular quality of imaginations and world making is ever more fascinating in relation to the pandemic. Here is an excerpt from South Canara District Manual of the flu that came in 1890, brought by ship, as most illnesses appeared in this manner in colonial occupations. I found this just when the pandemic began, well, because I was also writing my thesis at the time. And speculations and conspiracy theories were around the coronavirus as a man-made virus and how the virus spreads through touch and breath. Harold Stewart here records the flu as having subsided during the monsoon. How did this happen? What was interesting for me was to wonder about the world then and how it differs from now. To me, it was the porous nature of the human world at that time, that the natural organic world was able to transform the flu from its deadly nature to dissipate it or absorb it or even tame it. That mud, lime plaster, rock, organic debris, the humid atmosphere, other inhabitants were all players in this dilution of the flu. It is also the nature of dwellers of this wet world to largely inhabit the outdoors. Life happened outside, in the environment, while today we cocoon ourselves in enclosures attempting to protect ourselves from the ordinary realities. Today we struggle to understand this fast-changing, chemically composed, in isolation, invisible thing called the coronavirus. As we inhabit a world made of concrete, glass, and metal, designed to be permanent. This is seen in the way the pandemic has affected urban areas, much greater than rural and remote places. As for planning, we need a watery approach, privileging holding systems and responsiveness, flexible, adaptive, soft infrastructures for new kinds of development based on collective values and community needs and livelihoods, as opposed to a capitalistic economic modus operandi. The lines we draw can no longer divide the world in order to manage it better. Rather, the lines we inscribe into the world are those everyday practices of dwelling, of accepting the truth of movements that are real and physically appropriating the world, landscape, and wateryness. In this world of inhabiting or dwelling, time may be read in the rhythms of movements and practices, in the weather and ground conditions, rhythms of activities corresponding with contextual elements extending through the locale, constructing what Tim Ingold calls taskscapes. Task is a practical operation. These blur drawn boundaries and work with horizons encountered by walking. Every task is situated within and along multiple trajectories of other tasks or practices, their lines intertwined and knotted. Every task takes its meaning from its position within an ensemble of tasks performed in a series or in parallel, and usually by many people working together, such as thatching a roof. I quote Tim Ingold here. Yes. It is to the entire ensemble of tasks and their mutual interlocking that I refer to as taskscape. Just as the landscape is an array of related features, so by analogy, the taskscape is an array of related activities. Time here is also not linear. It's not the linear metronomically measured element of the world, nor is it a measure of efficiency and productivity and permanence. Time is held within rhythmic meshworks of movements of practice in this temporal world. These practices or taskscapes are trajectories of movements and pauses. Walking being a meta practice and dwelling or home is always becoming an ecotone, a place of transformation. Time needs no measure, as it can only be experienced through the act of dwelling practices, while these practices actually follow rain in this region. Dwelling is in a world that is not predictable or fixed, requires a sensibility of attentiveness. Being attentive to the practices and materials in daily life builds a sensitivity and openness to a changing world. Attention, care, engaging, getting involved in the landscape, in homemaking or placemaking and its transformations. This is different from being a user of a pre-designed and predefined space. Here the walker is the ordinary inhabitant, is the agent, is the placemaker, is the transient, is the designer. You and me, first as dwellers rather than first as professionals. Today, one can map places without prior walking by remote sensing satellite imagery. The challenge is to break out of these entrenched knowledges of disciplinary and social constructs coming from the outsider that draws boundaries and separates and groups things, creating an objectness. Instead, perhaps we need to explore the relationalities when thinking of design practices. In the drainage imagination, vulnerability is seen as something negative, a quality to change with something else, to be destroyed. However, in a threshold imagination, vulnerability is a quality that enables adaptation, rather than fixing things in the world. To be vulnerable is to be exposed to a changing world and to have the ability to transform with it and to respond. Resilience is the ability to recover from adversity through feedback without a complete departure from the original systemic functions. Or it's the ability to change state or shift into a new regime or paradigm. Resilience is also the ability to deal with uncertainty, instability, and changing landscapes, to seek creative opportunities and be capable to adapt and respond to adversity in the everyday. If we view vulnerability as a condition of being in the weather world, exposed to the complexities of the environment, it becomes a base condition for correspondence with the multitude of goings-on in the environment. It requires a certain agility to transform and include change in the everyday. If we see the world as being rhizomatic of trajectories of rhythmic practices that continually construct temporal places, it requires that we shift the paradigm from closed systems to open ones, of giving in to the dramatic changes in the environment rather than resisting them or arresting them. Perhaps these shifts of the static world can be seen as moments of change that are transformative and enable design of responsive tactics. If we see a world of problems, we design solutions to fix them. In architecture and design, these are usually presented as limitations or constraints of site, of landscape. If we are to inhabit and design for a threshold imagination, a world of wetness, these seemingly limiting qualities ought to be the things we actually correspond with in the design. It is first of the reality of change that we need to embrace as we become sensitized and familiarized with places again and again, knowing it will change and familiarizing again. Rather than looking and observing site features that privilege landscapes as objects within objects, it is necessary to think through the qualities of places by considering and deeply exploring the threshold imagination, as each place demands a complex engagement and invention of methods to see how the environment presents itself as we encounter it. Water is not H2O. It is elemental and material. Water does not move linearly. It seeps, oozes, infiltrates, soaks, inundates, precipitates, rises, defying gravity, moving non-linearly through materials, our bodies, and the atmosphere. Wetness is an ordinary condition. I'd like to close with a quote from Astrid Niemanis. Water flows through and across difference. Water does not ask us to confirm either the irreducibility or alterity or material connection, always making ecotones. An ecotone is also a zone of fecundity, creativity, transformation, of becoming, assembling, multiplying, of diverging, differentiating, and relinquishing. Something happens. Estuaries, tidal zones, wetlands, these are all liminal spaces where two complex systems meet, embrace, clash, and transform one another, perhaps even beginning here. Eco, home, tone, tension. We must learn to be at home in the quivering tension of the in-between. No other home is available. In between nature and culture, in between biology and philosophy, in between the human and everything we ram ourselves up against, everything we desperately shield ourselves from, everything we throw ourselves into, wrecked and recklessly, watching, amazed as our skins become thinner. Home is how we inhabit the world. Home is when our feet dwell. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Deepta. That was quite something. Thank you so much. We'll go straight to Himanshu and then have a chat.
Okay, great. So it's actually it's wonderful to follow Deepta's presentation because she has really fleshed out a number of themes that and of course authors who are important to my own way of thinking, and in fact in some ways my presentation will complement hers by perhaps focusing on something which is at the center of the problem that she identifies, and I deliberately called it the tree of knowledge, and I was wondering what to call this talk. Okay, and of course it's mischievous, and it's also, while I thought of the tree of knowledge as obviously the correspondence between the tree of, in terms of tree that we know as a tree and therefore represent in our as we are wont to in plan, and the tree that really is, but it reminded me of another tree, the tree that Christopher Alexander disavowed in saying that the city is not a tree. And all of these actually pivot around the idea of abstraction that I'm going to focus on as a key problematic. Next, please. So, to put it really baldly, at the core of what I'm going to say today, very briefly, and hopefully in a simple enough and direct enough a way as possible, is how we know the world, how we choose to know the world, or the ways of knowing the world that we privilege in our societies determine what we do in the world and what we do to the world. So that is at the core of my interest in the idea and the practice of abstraction. And I must say, though I've not really got into citations, etc., to keep it really clutter-free, but this interest in abstraction and my thinking through it is very owes a great debt to the work of Henri Lefebvre, the outlaw Marxist French philosopher, best known among architects for the production of space, but that's just one of the 70 books that he wrote, right? And he had something to say about everything, especially the everyday. And I draw, so abstraction has been abstraction as a condition, abstraction as a process, as a mode of knowing, is at the center of his critique of the kind of space that has been made hegemonic and has been actually produced after the emergence or the emergence into domination of the capitalist mode of production. What is interesting, and which is what makes what made Lefebvre get kicked out of the Communist Party that he was a member of in almost close to when he was 60, was that he sees that as also a feature of the socialist countries, socialist governments and states at that point in the 1950s, which brings him to really define the problem, to play with, of course, the issue that capitalism has been driving a particular kind of spatial production, as he calls it. But at the core of it is really a commitment to productivism, a commitment to creating a world which is about increasing productivity. And today, even if we are not increasing productivity in terms of manufacturing wildly, in increasing profit. And the profit need not be only of private capital. You can have state capitalism, you can have all varieties of things. And interestingly, in Lefebvre's critique, the liberal democratic state is part of the capitalist system. So it's not as if there is a big opposition between capitalist forces and the democratic state. So this is the background. But what is most interesting for us here, and which resonates with Deepta's observations about the way we have divided land and water and the lines and the need therefore for a threshold kind of imagination, is this mode of fixing the world in various abstractions, in categories, and then scrambling to deal with the usual boundary problems that brings with it. Next, please. So let's begin with a simple question. Right? We perhaps know what a tree is, but do we really know what a river is? And of course, Sabarmati is our favorite river right now to talk about, to agree on, to disagree on, and whatever, to model further developments on. So I'm just going to go through a few images. Next, please. So this is a lovely old image by Dashrath Patel of the Sabarmati, as it was before it ceased being a river and became a riverfront, a kind of appendage to the riverfront, perhaps. And what do you see in this is what I can see. I'm sure all of you too, is people, animals, sand, water, imagine, the webs and the rhythms that you can imagine with it, because there is work here, the livelihoods, and there's culture in the form of the red dyed cloth. And there's also some vegetation here in the middle of the river. Right? This is the middle of the riverbed. So the river is seen in this image as this socio-natural process. We have been talking about the habitat or architecture and all of these things as processes, and a lot of people, I wouldn't be surprised if they have kind of had it with the word process, because what does the damn thing mean, right? What does it mean to say a building is a process, right? So this is where, in a sense, you see that the river, if you think of it really as a practice, a natural event, a natural sequence of events, unpredictable, and involving many other practices, social, animal, and so on, then it starts becoming a very complex kind of thing which we, in shorthand can call process. Next, please. So, but how do we turn this river into knowledge? This is a problem. We are all educated people. We have to teach something in our schools. Right? So this map. Okay. So before we go, let me talk about a bit about the map. Clearly, the map we know is not the territory, and the map is not really. The map is a very very reduced and selective representation of whatever is being mapped, as James Scott himself notes in that classic book that is necessary to, I think, just being barely educated, seeing like a state. He makes the obvious point that a map cannot have all the details of the geography or the social geography that is being mapped, because it will be useless. Right? You want maps have to perform certain functions, so they have to leave out a lot of other details. So when you take a look at the map of India, the river is just a line, especially the big river. The small river is absent. Then you have a less reductive map like this, which actually shows, and this is just off Wikipedia. This is not. I've not done any real research on this. I'm just looking for some maps for Sabarmati, and this caught my attention. What is nice about it is not just one line. It's not even two lines. Okay, that's like great, because it's water and it is land. It is some sense of terrain, a watershed. It also has other rivers and other streams that are coming into. So the river is not reduced to this one single nice, neat double line that starts somewhere and ends somewhere. More interestingly, the river here, going back to the idea of the process, is actually imaginable as a process, because it starts somewhere, the water flows down and then flows out into the sea. So there is the river is, in that sense, a very fashionable word now, performed event. Right? It's not really performed by people, but it's something that happens. It's a constant event under making. What is also very interesting is you don't know when it would have water and when it would be dry. You can broadly expect in a river like the Sabarmati, which is seasonal, that you'll be happy if you had water in Ahmedabad for about 4 months, is what I hear from people who know better than me. So, the fact that the river is also a temporal reality, which means it changes in time, is something which this map simply lies about, because it cannot handle that kind of complexity. So to really understand the river, you need the river this kind of spatial map, fixed satellite image kind of map, and then you need a timeline, and which would also be a freezing of patterns that have been averaged out over a period of time. So there is a freezing in space, there's a freezing in time, and all knowledge, what we call, understand as knowledge, and which we give out, commodify through degrees and whatever other ways, is fundamentally this kind of scientific abstraction. Right? Why do I say this? I don't say this to say that we just junk it. I say this simply to for us to start recognizing it for what it is. Now, what does it mean to abstract? At its root, abstraction is about separation. You separate when you say this is the river and this is land, you separate land from water. Very simple. And you enforce that separation through a line. My favorite question has always been in class, let's go to the beach, show me the line. So you will send out an army to protect the line, the coastline as territory, yeah? But you go to the beach and there is no line. Okay, so this is a kind of, it is a concretization. It is it's very interesting, this line between land and water, because there is no such fixed line. It is a produced line. It's a constructed line, and the basis of it is again some kind of averaging. It's exactly like the average human being who you may search high and dry and you won't find, but that average human being is fixed in some senses, at least as a band, in terms of how many calories he or she needs and stuff like that. So knowledge for us has after the Enlightenment, as Deepta also mentioned, has been founded on the principle of abstraction, and Lefebvre contrasts that with a lived knowledge, which is of course the kind of knowledge that Deepta has given us great insights into. And this contradiction, this conflict between two forms of knowledge is at the heart of, for me, the challenge that we as architects, I say we, though I am lapsed, it'll take me a while to fully reconcile to being the heretic that many think I am. I'm not. Okay. So next, please. How we know is what we do. If I have drawn the river endlessly from school as a line, then I have to produce the river as a line. And what I mean by that is, it's not as if I'm not conscious of it. I'm not conscious of the fact that there's something. It's not compulsive, but it is a habit of thought where abstractions and the various things that get smuggled in, that form the content of abstraction, the whole process, including categorization. One of the best examples of categorizations that cause enormous and visible violence, I mean, it's become visible to us only recently, is the simple gender classification, man and woman. And we are beginning to see how much mischief and violence that has caused. But equal amounts of violence to nature, and of course, because we are, after all, in nature, and we are from nature, and we depend on nature, it causes to people. Now, this is very interesting as a couple of images on the top left and right, because it shows you how a particular imagination, which predates your approach to your definition of the problem, how that produces your solution. So your solution is implicit in what you have, what you bring to the problem. I had, in fact, when the Smart Cities mission was announced, EPW asked me to write something, and I was trying to make sense of it. It was 2014, right? We've not heard of Smart Cities almost. And then after pottering about, I realized that really it's the smart cities are really a solution in search of a problem. So this is something that is very typical of planning, that you already bring to the table, and not just of planning, let me add, it's true of all professions. So the problem that I am talking about, abstraction, is not something that is unique to us and we have to beat our breasts over it at how unfortunate we are. It is specific to or general across disciplines, modern disciplines and modern professions. So let me go back to this image on the left. What it shows us, if you look carefully, is the Sabarmati has this peculiar habit, has this peculiar characteristic of being sandy to the north and sandy to the south, but liquid in the middle. And that's very strange, right? It's very, very difficult to figure that out if you have not actually gone there and seen that it's not very difficult to see. You understand, because you've got water being pumped in from somewhere and poured into the river. So what, in a sense, has happened to the river is, if you think of the river as a process which starts with it springing out of a source, passing through, interacting with the landscape and nature all along, being subject to the weather, okay, and to various other forces, and finally finding its way into the sea. If that is the river, then this little patch of dark blue in the middle, perfectly in the city, is not really a river. It's some kind of spatial product. So this is very, for me, this is interesting, because it is not about a particular architect or a particular school of thought. It is about architecture in general and the architectural imagination, which is completely in the grip of geometry, because geometry is the as a kind of chapter of mathematics. It's the most organized and logical representation of the spatial world, and architecture is basically say cornered in Euclidean space, which is an abstract space. And this is only one of those examples of the realization of that space, except this is at a cityscape. Of course, we have much greater examples that we really look up to and constantly do arti of, like Chandigarh or so many others, where geometry is more real. Geometry is basically an abstraction, right? This whole realm of abstract knowledge, which is treated as more real and therefore imposed on the situation, on the ground itself. And what is interesting in both cases, whether it's Chandigarh or here or so many other examples, is how nature, as well as certain social groups, so it's not just nature, as well as certain social groups, are conceived of as being inert. You assume that in Mumbai, we assume that we will be able to build a road through the sea as a coastal road, because our abstract engineering knowledge is powerful enough to actually withstand whatever is in the way, and the sea is a known, is a known, scientifically known phenomenon. That is the assumption. Of course, we know that is not the case. Otherwise, we wouldn't, have discovered climate change, or we wouldn't be in such a tiz about what, how sea levels will rise and what the impacts would be and so on. So we can talk about the limits of this abstract knowledge in reality, and the assumption that we have of the thoroughgoing and saturation of reality by the intellect, that underlies expert culture. Next, please. So what kind of concrete resilience does this abstract, the realization of the abstract form, or abstract vision where land and water are separate, what kind of resilience does it promise? Well, it cannot promise very much. It either holds firm for that moment, or it just goes away. What is also very interesting is it has, because of the fact that the line is firm. It's also very interesting that the line is drawn as being very sharp and definitive, and the concrete wall must also be built like that. If you have a permeable wall, then there is some kind of violence being done to the sharpness of that line. And that sharpness, incidentally, I want to just remind you, is tied to the sharp distinction between land and water that has been offered. That underlies our imagination. Next, please. That incidentally was a image from a flood, sort of, when water was released from the dam upstream at the Sabarmati river front. So, architecture, you could say, and of course I'm not talking of architecture as just pure design and quality of design and so on. I'm talking of the structure of our practice and the way it is imagined and what the underlying set of assumptions are. These are two terms I just offer as ways of characterizing and connecting the complete, shall I say, the strong anchoring of architectural practice in the property regime. So the plot of land, you can also imagine as a kind of conspiracy, if you like something lurid like that, right? That it is the land that we build on as architects is always property, is always owned as property. And we have to remember that unless we are part of that belief system, which thinks private property is inviolate, it's actually natural, right? We are not in the current way the practice of architecture is set up. You won't even be able to get your fees, because who can build on land? Only the landowner. And that ownership already presumes so many different things, that it presumes that the earth is fully distributed among discrete, separate owners. There are no gray zones. So there's no space for the commons. Even though we know that till 200 years ago, the regime of private property, and certainly in India, was not the kind of hegemonic regime that we know it as today. And even like 50 years ago, land was not the kind of commodity it is today. In fact, even the last 25 years, the prices of land in remote rural areas have just shot up inexplicably. And that can only be explained with reference to some kind of the market in land having completely penetrated the entire world almost in some way or the other. Now, the plot of private property that we are part of shapes how we think. I mean, look at how we operate as designers, starting from your first year in college. What do you get? The first thing you get in your studio, and which is exactly what you get in your practice when you are, when you have done 50 years of work and won all the big prizes, is a plot boundary. Can you imagine the practice of architecture without the plot boundary? Is a useful question to start. Now, to complement that is the trap of form. And the trap of form is the abstraction of the building again into the realm of geometry, where even when we as architects who practice for a while, when we hire younger people who've just come out of college and we complain that they can't even draw a staircase section properly, things don't add up between plan and section of the staircase, it's because it's not surprising, because they are trained to think of the building, the black line, the space between two lines is white. It is nothing. The thickness of the wall has no weight. So the third dimension is missing, and then you have to work very hard to master the third dimension. But what about the other dimensions? They are far away from the set of considerations that we are used to taking on board. So how Bijoy was concerned, I would only be the bearer of bad news, right? And I'm also concerned because I'm not a pessimist, right? And I believe in practice of all kinds. So I don't have a lot of time because, of course, my talk was unscripted. But I will end with 2 or 3 examples to show that there is a way of getting out of, not completely, there's no magic bullet, we know that, but there are ways of getting out of it. And a simple way of doing that is to simply get real. From looking at the world with what I have before called once the distant eye. These architects are actually trained to cultivate a distant eye. You are in the. I mean, I have been amazed at myself sometimes that I am in a house that I have designed under construction, and it's not been built very well. But I take pleasure in the form. Right? I'm able, sitting inside the room, to see it as if it's a form, as if I am out of it. So we need to move back in, and Deepta provided very good, I think, very beautiful insights into what that real would be and can be. And there's a whole infinity of that kind of reality that is open for us to explore. I am very fascinated in the ugliness of the city, and that is where I work much more. But I'll give you 3 beautiful sort of examples. Well, not beautiful, but yeah, whatever. So we return to the concrete, except this is not the concrete of cement. Yeah, we return from abstraction to the concreteness of the world, and it is actually, I believe, it is liberating, because next, how do we explain the work of Laurie Baker? Okay, whatever is the positive value in his work, I understand it most directly in terms of a complete freedom that he managed to get for himself from preconceived ideas about technology, about aesthetics. He went in and looked at what is around, looked at the site, looked at even this one tree here, and built around it. And this is not, I want to emphasize, this is not a sentimental, it's not a call for a sentimental or highly poetic kind of approach. It is simply a realistic approach that one is talking about. There is a tree, there is soil. We know that if you take away the topsoil, you'll really have a problem very soon. How do you take account of it? How do you respond to it? The problem of abstraction has been that we have erased most of what matters in the world, and most of the relationships that constitute the world, and we have separated things out only for convenience and for control and for whatever purposes that serves. Okay, so next, and of course you don't have to be only in that alternative, khadi kurta, do your own building, and not that kind of way at all, because I think what we are talking about is a thorough empiricism, and it doesn't mean, in my mind, to keep the kind of space of possibility wide, it doesn't mean that you completely eschew abstraction or things that you associate with bad abstraction. And there has to be a dialectic that we keep alive between the local, real, the complexity of the environment and the history you intervene in, and the givenness of every situation. because practice, okay, cannot escape the givenness. And what is very interesting in Lefebvre, and which resonates with the tribal elders point that Deepta mentioned, is he's ultimately oriented, he's ultimately interested, and he believes that there is a possible in the real, and that possible in the real is what we have to find our path towards. Okay. And this is an example. This is the Agilent headquarters in Manesar by Sanjay Prakash and his Shift studio. It's very, if you were to judge buildings by what they look like from outside, you will just dismiss this building. But only when you get into the building, okay, only, and I don't mean in terms of inside, but you get inside the logic through which the building has been designed, and the set of considerations that have been taken on board, and the kind of responses within the givenness of the fact that this is a corporate project, and so on and so forth, it offers you a better and more empirically sound, slightly more future-proofed kind of pathway. Or next, please. At the other end of the scale, you could you could acknowledge the concreteness of a situation like in the Kosi, with the Kosi River constantly shifting course over a very broad, wide area of many kilometers. What kind of housing do you provide which is resilient? And this is Hunarshala's project, and something straight off their website, where again there is existing knowledge historically produced, there's existing practices, but there is also value that can be added by what I just critiqued as, which is the abstract knowledge of abstract scientific knowledge. There's also some value there which you can join, we can bring in, because they are finally a dialectic. They both constitute each other. You can't separate one from the other. And what was created was a system of building with bamboo and many other techniques, which emerged from the traditions and the local resources. But what was fascinating was that system was finally turned around, pivoted on one single tool, okay, with which one could build that house. And this system also took on board, did not come with preconceived ideas about what is a good pakka house which can withstand the river, right? Because in that region there is a living with the flood, and you just build higher. You build a building on stilts, let the water come, let it even inundate, and then it goes away. So you discover what is already as a fact on the ground in terms of knowledge, practices, technologies, and on the basis of that you craft your act. It is the one of the real issues with our how we are trained as experts to practice is that we already we prioritize act over fact, and that act is what you are already trained, what you already have as a palette of solutions, approaches, and fixed knowledge, and it's a closed knowledge. But if you were to start with the fact, which is the fact on the ground, the fact of nature, the fact of social life, the fact of relations between them, the fact of relations within nature and within within societies that you are intervening in, and the relations between what the locations and systems you intervene in and the other broader systems. If we started with the fact, that is with greater empiricism, I think we would be able to fashion practices which are less, which will create less vulnerability, will create less damage both to society as well as to nature. Okay, so I think I'm done. Next, if I remember right. Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you, Himanshu. Man, that's quite a dynamite set of lectures. And you guys didn't talk separately, right? You guys didn't coordinate these two lectures yesterday after our chat.
No, we didn't.
It's unbelievable. Well, I'm kind of overwhelmed. The thing that comes to mind immediately is that I think it's 1920 or something. This painting by René Magritte. It's called The Treachery of Images, and it says, "This is not a pipe."
Yeah.
And so it's written, "This is not a pipe." Below, there's an image of the pipe, and of course, neither of those two things is the pipe, because you got to have the pipe to smoke it, and you have to walk the ground to know it. So it's well, not completely despondent, but I had a couple of questions, some sort of more operational questions for you, Deepta, particularly just to with your students, and we have a whole bunch of students here attending as well, that with your students, when you're out on the Western Ghats and you're sort of observing and walking the ground, could you describe that to me? I mean, what do you do? What are the modes of this observation and this sensing, if you will, not looking?
Okay, so this kind of has evolved as a process for me over the last, I don't know, maybe 8 years or so. One of them is, initially we were sort of looking at design and what design can do in environmentally sensitive places. And particularly we began working with the Forest Rights Act, actually, looking at communities who wanted to assert their rights in the forest because they were being evicted. What we wound up doing first was to see how we can use design as a tool to look at problem solving. Very quickly, we realized, because one of the groups that we worked with in Kutch specifically was they designed a board game. And then we had worked with lawyers who took the board game back to the camel Maldharis, actually. And the Maldharis didn't understand a single visual that the students had drawn. This became like my first insight to sort of think about, how do they see? What do they see? Like on one of the cards, there was a silhouette of a camel, but they didn't recognize the camel as a camel. And they were like, what is this? So, which was amazing because they obviously don't see the camel from a distance as a form. So that was one of my first questions, actually. So if they don't see what we see, what do they see and how do they see it? And so when I go into the field, we actually do some prep work before that. We start to look at developing a lens to go to the field with, so that there is a broad frame for students to sort of get a sense of how to do research prior to. So sometimes they look into archives and there's no Wikipedia, no internet stuff that we look at. We actually look for practices and processes. So for example, one group of students looked at, one of the ideas was, I said, pick a thing in the Ghats. Anything. It could be a tree, it could be a soil, it could be a house, it could be a community, it could be an event, like a yakshagana, it could be anything. So the students chose mackerel, the fish, and they went in depth into researching everything they could find about the mackerel in that, because that's where they're fished, in that region in South Canara. And it was amazing because they actually created this amazingly visual narrative of the mackerel, how communities engage with it. So the way they even visualized what they put together, which was not pre-decided how they would visualize it, but the way the story unraveled was amazing. But in their presentation, they tended to focus on movement. And so the lens became movement, actually. So when they went to the field, they were looking for anything that moved. And to also acknowledge that the self is moving, right? So that's like the beginning thing. And then along the way in the field, they also start to figure out what they're alert to, what they're sensitive to. And so we have these, we constantly have conversations, really, because I'm learning from them, they're learning from me, and we're constantly walking this terrain, which changes every day. And so that's really how the studios are initiated. And just to quickly share one nugget, in 2018, actually, right after our trip to Avani, I went to South Canara with about 15 students. And in that trip, it just rained the whole time. and 3 students had never stepped in a puddle in their lives. And I was just shocked. I said, so since then I've been taking students in the monsoon. So yeah, so that's just the beginning of the studio. Yeah.
There's also this other thing which both of you mentioned, and this is really the notion of siting. The idea that that you would get a plot of land in the studio, that you're given a piece of land, and then of course you're off to the races. You're starting to draw the thing out, and it reminded me of the market masterclass where we spend I was fortunate to go, and then you're out in the middle of this incredible estate, the Boyd estate. It's, I don't know, hundreds of acres. And on the first day, after initiations and introductions, the tutors just let you out, like, okay, go out and do whatever it is you want to do, and we're all waiting for the drawing, and we want to get the stuff so that we can start working, and there's nothing, right? You're just let out. And the whole exercise of that masterclass, at least in my mind, when I think back at it, it is really to understand where to locate whatever it is you want to locate, and what then to locate there. So what is the ground where you want to engage with, and the way that you come to that, of course, it's a very short time frame, but it is through this idea of walking, through the idea of walking and drawing, and we had an engineer in our group who was part of the group. He didn't draw at all. And so for one of the reviews, he had collected samples of water from across, I don't know, 50, 60 acres. He'd walked around, and he had these 10 bottles of water from different parts of the site. And he was imagining the site through that lens, just like you were talking about. Coming to you, Himanshu, about your incredibly balanced critique of the Sabarmati project, I must say. The struggle that I have is a struggle of the imagination in terms of scale. And I don't know if you want to make that correlation, that somehow we've just gone way past that point where, I don't know, I'm just playing devil's advocate, but that we've gone past that point where we can operate like Hunnarshala does at scale. That we can't do the precious thing that Bijoy Jain does. We can't do Vinu Daniel. We've just lost the plot, we've just gone way past that point, and I don't know what it means. I don't know. I'm asking.
So there's a theme that I have not that I've never really, I think, publicly spoken much about, which is involved here. So there are 2 things that are involved here. One is the theme of, say, designing yourself as the architect. What are you? What do you want to? What do you believe? And how do you live that belief? So that's one thing. The other is directly in terms of the way, why it is that you or the urban world or the architect in the city is way beyond or way past the possibility of working like a Hunnarshala or whoever else. There are many such exceptionals that we hold up, and that's of course a critique I have in general, that from time immemorial we have been saying, oh, Nari Gandhi, he is like that, so he can't, I can't be like that, kind of thing. I have family to support and so on. I think so these 2 are related. One is the political economic structuring of the practice of the profession. So you are literally, you are really trapped in the plot of land. You are squarely in the middle of the property regime, and you are servicing property. You're servicing the property regime as architects. We have this, both as academics, and especially if you are, little critically minded and you have these pretensions of little radicalism and all, both academics and architects, because these are the 2 worlds I've inhabited, often suffer from this false consciousness that you are free agents, right? That you have a critique, critical regionalism. So you have a critique on something, right? Well, you're if you really don't redesign yourself as the architect, then you're critiquing, you have been given a little plot of freedom within which to critique each other. Okay, Korea is okay too. I will be more intricate, right? And it is practices, whether it's Hunarshala or even Sanjay Prakash, who operates at scale. That's why I brought Agilent in, who operates at corporate scale where required, and has also built bamboo buildings and participatory, 300 schools in.
Right.
I think we need to, rather than look at the craft and obsess over the craft, the poetry endlessly, and the poetry of abstract form finally, right? And which is a very, very problematic in many ways, but I won't get into it now. Instead of doing that, if we spend a little bit of that time budget we have and the intellectual kind of budget we have on examining the conditions of our practice, the conditions of our formation of ourselves. See, I mean, I have been a practicing architect, and I have been from inside. Once I step out, I begin to see myself, which I wouldn't have believed, so much more clearly, because I know how much of vanity is involved in that. And I'm not someone, I believe, who's really far down the vanity path, but I know it's very much there, right? You are a designer, and similarly, as an academic, I might be a precious, thinker. I have this new thing I'm saying, right? All of those things, whether you're architect, academic, or any other practitioner, or an NGO practitioner, you have to examine your practice, right? Because that is determining a lot of the specifics. And of course, you have to determine you have to examine the small parts, the intricacies of that, as we have done enormously for many years. I don't know, I hope that answers, but I know it's not necessarily a direct answer.
No, it kind of sorry, there's no, it reminds me of Wittgenstein saying that this is the work of an architect is basically the work of discovering oneself, and in a way that's what you're saying, that you articulate your mode of engagement, you articulate how you want to be in the world, and that's the bigger question than the limits of your plot, I guess. In fact, in the gap between the first session and the second session, there was an amazing presentation at Seed by Milinda Patiraja. I don't know if you know this architect from Sri Lanka. And the incredible thing about it is that he, of course, made this chart which had all of these binaries. So labor and capital, knowledge and knowledge and skill, practice and research. And he was talking about this kind of an engagement as an architect where you were trying to blend these two things into one thing. And the critical, one of the really lovely things in a lot of his projects was that he was designing for, if you will, bad construction. Because most of his buildings were built by the people who so one of the libraries that he built in a school were built by the parents who were farmers during the day, and then in the off season would build this small building. But then the building has all of these tolerances to allow for a little bit here and there, that it isn't the precise, precious object, but it gives space for this kind of, and just like Baker's wonderful image, which is you're at the site and you suddenly realize that here's, certain conditions that I need to respond to, and then modulating then to accommodate that, which is quite wonderful. Also, the other thing that I just wanted to bring up was this. It's interesting that you use Thevoyeur and Walker, because for me, I think Thevoyeur, at least the way that I've understood it, is actually a way to inhabit the world where you become the world. That you because of your anonymity and because you're in the world, looking at it and engaging with it in a sort of benign way, that nobody notices you, and then you are one with it, you are one with the world. So I think an even more sophisticated way of being the walker, I don't know, maybe. But that's constantly, the thing that reminded me from that walking thing was another architect, Neil McLaughlin from England. He runs a studio at the Bartlett, and what he does is he takes his group of students out into the landscape, and he again throws them out into the landscape and just register whatever, and then to do a drawing together. So there's a huge sheet of paper on the ground, and you draw from whatever sketches you make, and you make a sort of coalesced drawing of the landscape as a communal imagination of the ground. It's still a plan. It's still a plan, but it still has bits and pieces of other voices in the way that plan is made. I'm kind of out of questions. If I don't know if Deepta and Himanshu, if you guys want to ask questions of each other, or if you have comments on the presentations, anything. Oh, we have a question. Safe. Abu, are you here? Do you want to ask the question yourself?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me, Himanshu?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, thanks, Himanshu, for a very lovely talk, and it was very relatable because it sort of echoes and resonates. I had one comment or feedback or maybe a question, that it would have been interesting if you could have inverted your opening punchline. So it should be, or it could be, what we do is how we know. I would say that sort of resonates more with the Marxist analysis. You quoted Lefebvre, and Deepta also talked about Tim and Gold. So I think we need to, and one of the problem with architectural thinking, education, studios, classrooms, everything is we are too idealist. We sort of follow too much amount of German ideology in the way we talk about concept and thinking and everything. So, and even you're talking about materiality, reality. So I think it should be more like what we do is how we know. And I think that would be a good point of departure for us to problematize the problems around us. The second point I would say is that in terms of abstraction, I think one of the ways, when you mentioned line geometry and you mentioned land, water, and I couldn't agree again more with that. But again, the problem is that we are still, even even in a way, even in spite of actually critiquing abstraction, we are still sort of still in that circle only of abstraction, because maybe I would say that what we need to do, maybe a way out could be to accept that we cannot evade language and representation, maybe to accept and educate the students about the politics of representation, because whatever we do, abstraction and representation are always going to be sort of with us, right? And you mentioned gendered, and exactly, Judith Butler exactly mentions it like this, that how gender is a performative, the whole concept of performative, and how it is actually a representational thing. So I would say that instead of critiquing one form of abstraction, and sort of saying that okay, this has limitations, let's I think accept that abstraction or representation always has politics embedded in them, or say power relations embedded in them. And then we can start what kind of power relations are embedded in scientific abstractions, representations, or the different kinds of representations which are propounded by different disciplines. So yeah, sorry, I think I took too much amount of time and over explained it, but yeah.
No, that was very useful, and really, I'm so glad to hear your interest and your conceptualization of much of this theory. I'll actually turn what you said on you, by saying that, in fact, you gave me a very good idea, and I am going to redo that slide. It was done in a hurry. So it's how we know is what we do is how we know is what we do. It's really a dialectic, right? That is perhaps the better way of putting it. And you're absolutely right about it is inadequate to vilify abstractions. So my critique is that abstraction, or what Lefebvre calls the conceived moment, is dominant. It has run away with the game, and the lived, whether it is of the slum dweller in Mumbai or of the in the Western Ghats, the farmer, that lived moment has been kind of repressed. Right? So if we keep that dialectic alive in our description of the world, then what also follows is we recognize that power resides not merely in the abstract, in the conceived moment, it also resides in the lived. Because what is very interesting about Lefebvre, which makes him really a fascinating thinker, he doesn't say that the lived is. He in fact conceives of the lived, which you would normally think would be very individual and psychological and bodily, which is of course there, but it is also socialized. It's also socially produced. It's a realm of meaning, which means that if I am in a patriarchal society, my lived knowledge, okay, or a caste society, then all our traditional knowledges and traditional wisdom, we have to start by assuming it will be organized around a caste hierarchy. I had this fantastic and very educative moment. Fortunately, that's a moment where my vanity as an architect was nicely, shall I say, reset. Is a nice way of putting it. Where this is a house that my wife Malini and I designed in Kerala, where we created, we used some old old materials from old building here on the site and created a beautiful courtyard, modern house, modern tradition, all that lovely light and all the usual stuff, and endlessly photographing our own fantastic creation and people coming in and saying, oh lovely and all that. Fine, all that is great. And then we had this visitor, and we had this group of theater people who came to see it. And there was this one guy who is now, I think, a well-known theater director, who made everyone else was quite happy with that kind of tradition, modern blend and stuff like that. But this guy made a very profound statement. He said, when I look at the Theravada model, it reminds me of the caste oppression of the Nayars. Okay? And the Theravada, the beautiful courtyard house that we all love. I mean, I am like totally in love with the courtyard houses, the temples of Kerala and all of that, right? But it made me alive to what I have been blind to, okay, which I would have expected me, at least, to have thought about. I had not thought about it. I had, in the abstract, kind of said yes. So I think this kind of traditional lived knowledge comes with its own politics, as does the imposed knowledge of the expert. Okay. Thanks.
I wanted to just quickly respond about one of the points. I think this whole notion of representation is, it's really important because you're right, we cannot move away from representation. But I think the base understanding of a place can be seen differently, can be recorded differently. And I think, so in that notion, if we think of presentation versus representation as two different kinds of things that we do as designers or as inhabitants of the world in that way, then you could think of walking as a way of, it's a practice that actually responds to the world as it is presented to you in the walk. And so how much can you sort of gather in terms of a sensibility and a sensitivity to that experience? And then how would you extract from that as a whole experience, to extract from that the kinds of elements that you would look at for design per se? And then after that would come a representation or an interpretation and then a representational mode. And just quickly to respond to Bijoy's thing about voyeurism is also, I think you're thinking about being a voyeur when no other humans see you. However, when you're walking, you're moving the air around you. There are also maybe dogs and birds and worms that feel you as you're walking through. So I think one of the things is the walker, to me, is somebody who is sensitive to everything. And just being in that moment to be sensitive is I mean, it takes a little bit of development and training, and you sort of, when you're in the field, you have to sort of get into that zone and shed everything else, shed the known world actually, and then you become the walker. And it's not easy. You're always still both, but you have to sort of navigate that cautiously. So yeah.
There is a question from Kshama. Shall we take that?
Thank you so much. It was very amazing, Deepta and Himanshu. And your approach to map and citing and the ecological aspects, both of you. Well, for me, what I learned today is a very amazing line of thread which you both commonly touched, which is called boundaries for me. Because when I heard about the topic, vulnerable ecosystems and resilience, I was willing to hear more about multiple ecosystems and how do we deal with these ecosystems as humans in the lived environment. But somehow I could find a line of thread you both are sharing, but you did not enhance it more. So as far as this is concerned, abstract and concrete, I feel it's more about boundaries. It's about boundaries of living, boundaries about existing, it's boundaries between what is nature and what is artificial, and many other boundaries which are existing from so many years. So especially the Sabarmati image which you shared gave me a thought how landscapes merge with each other, but to the contrast, we humans are persistent on creating boundaries. You rightly gave a perfect example of man and woman. We initially decided them to be very different, and then now we are trying to equalize them. We're trying to give them equal rights. We're trying to treat them equally. We're wanting to treat them on both levels, same. So we really have to change our perspective and look into blurring boundaries, which will create an interdependency of multiple ecosystems. And I think that is where the answer lies, in getting back the ecosystems which we are losing every day in and out. Your contrast image of Sabarmati River and the image of the river in the city, which was having a very strict boundaries, made me realize that we are somewhere defining ourselves and confining ourselves to not mix and intermerge with each other, and that is what the problem is. And I feel that's amazing insight that I've really learned today. So I just wanted to share with you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, it's just there's a lot to sort of unpack, especially for practicing architects. So it's been an amazing session. Thanks, Deepta. Thanks, Himanshu. And thanks for the questions, Abu and Shima. Thanks again, and good night. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Bye-bye. Yeah,
Bye.
thanks. Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.